This is a really, really special night. We are blessed to have Diana Shunn here, who is the director of the Child Advocacy Center of Sedgwick County. She is someone I really respect, and she is my go-to person when I have a question that a child asks me that I don't have an answer for. Sometimes they're pretty hard questions, that she helps me. I want you to think a minute about what a first responder is. A first responder, we know, is a fireman. We know it's a policeman. But I believe a first responder is also a doctor, a nurse, a Diana Shunn, someone who helps abused kids. I told some kids at a school, a high school, that had kids that had difficulties and through no fault of their own were having trouble graduating. So it was a special high school. I told them, I said, as far as child abuse is concerned, there's God, and then there's Diana Shunn. Oh my. No pressure. Come on, baby.
Thank you so much, first of all, for just joining us this evening and being willing to talk about a challenging topic. Your introduction is much too kind, I would have to say. I'm surrounded by a host of wonderful people all the time, and I think that that's part of the success of being able to work these cases for a little over 20 years now, is just being able to surround yourself with people that are brighter and smarter than you are and that have the same passion. So I think that is a huge component in regards to working with child abuse. So I'd like to spend the next several minutes just talking a little bit about child abuse recognition and why and how we all play a part in regards to that. I've been asked specifically to talk a little bit about our capital campaign and the efforts that we're making to be able to create a different environment where children come in for child abuse investigations. And then I know at the end of the evening we'll be spending some time answering questions as well. So look forward to spending some time here just talking a little bit about things that we can all do in that recognition phase in regards to child abuse awareness. So I know you can bring up the slides if you would at this time, and we'll move forward. Go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the general statistics. And if you spend any time looking at some of the poster boards that are available here for you to look at on the side, you'll see a lot of these same general numbers. I think the most important thing that we look at in regards to child abuse reporting is that whatever number we want to use, whatever research or statistic we choose to look at, we know that we're only reaching the very tip or the peak of the real issue and the problem that there is. We can guesstimate or estimate by the best efforts that we have that about 10% of all cases come forward and become recognized by the professionals that are working the cases. So there's a large majority, whatever number you want to choose, that will go under the radar and will not really become something that we have an attention or the ability to be able to get involved with in a lot of different cases. What we also know is that child abuse is not just a child-related issue, that this is an issue that has the opportunity to change someone's life. And once that change has happened, there's many things that can happen from a therapy and a supportive standpoint that can then again change the trajectory of where that event goes in their life. But one of the things that we know is that when children are not supported and children are not protected further from abuse, there can be some really long-term negative outcomes. And those are some of the things that we're really working to be able to try to make the best effort that we can to lower the impact of those long-term negative outcomes and really make people have the opportunity to have the best possible outcomes in the end as we look at those. So we can move on again. just a little bit about a year in review, so to speak, if we look at our 2013 statistics within the Child Advocacy Center. And we'll talk specifically about our team partners here in just a few moments. But the cases that we get involved with, you can see, are just a little under 1,900 cases last year. Predominantly, our children are under the age of 12. That's the largest percentage of children that we see. We certainly see a significant number of children that are even pre-verbal, so not able to give us a history of what has happened, but we rely on their siblings or other witnesses or relatives or someone else to be able to give us a history of what might have happened in regards to that particular case. And by and large, you can see that 68% of our cases are sexual in nature. We certainly have physical abuse cases, and our unit gets assigned the more severe physical abuse cases. And I know that might sound kind of an odd terminology, but the way it's classified out, that's who is assigned to work those particular cases. But the more severe kinds of cases where there is physical trauma present, whether that be abdominal trauma or head trauma, a broken bone, some kind of injury that has been present, are typically the cases then that are being worked and coordinated through the Child Advocacy Center. And then we kind of have a host of other different kinds of trauma and child abuse then that we also get involved with, whether that be runaway cases, witnesses to different kinds of violence, human trafficking, a variety of other kinds of cases kind of fall into that smaller percentage of the total numbers of cases that we tend to work. And we can move to the next one. I think the more important thing that we oftentimes don't have the opportunity to talk as much about is where the protection factors come from and where we need to be focusing. I recently had the opportunity to attend an education opportunity where Dr. Bruce Perry was the speaker, and he talked about how sad it is that we have to develop a system within our community to spend millions of dollars to be able to protect our children from their parents. And that's the reality that we live in. The largest majority of our offenders are the parents. And so when we look at our sexual abuse cases in particular, predominantly we see the biological fathers as being the number one abusers. When we look at physical abuse cases, by and large, those tend to be our stepfathers, boyfriends, or other persons living in the home or caring directly for the children. We have male and a female offender, so there is no exclusivity in regards to who might be the offender in particular. But about 9% of our cases, and that's again kind of a trend that we see pretty steadily over the years, about 9% of our cases will fall into that stranger category where the child isn't familiar with the person in any particular circumstance, and the family may not know them, so really much more into that what we would refer to as a stranger danger situation. So although strangers can be offenders, they by and large are not our majority of folks that we need to be concerned about, and so that it brings about that whole different level of suspicion and heightened awareness, and the fact that if the abuse is going on within the home by people that we assume are caring, loving individuals, that brings a different level of reason of why we need to become actively involved in these cases and proactive in being suspicious when we see something that doesn't seem to fit quite together. I think that there's reasons that we have that gut feeling in our lives where we get that feeling that something doesn't fit together, something isn't right. And I always encourage folks to act on that gut feeling. You have that gut feeling for a reason, whether it's, I think I left the coffee maker on, I think I might have left the iron on, I forgot to shut the garage door. You get those gut feelings, and then later you think, why didn't I listen to myself? Why didn't I listen to that gut feeling? And abuse can be no different in regards to that. When something doesn't quite make sense, the picture and the circumstances and what you're seeing and the explanation don't all fit together. There's usually a reason that happens. And again, I would hope that we learn more to be instinctual and listen to that gut feeling that we oftentimes will have. We can move forward again. And this is the one, thank you. So when we look specifically in regards to some adult kinds of numbers that I think can be helpful just to be able to get a general realm of frequency that abuse is occurring within our society. So we can see about 1 in 3 women or 1 in 4 women, depending again on which study in particular we're looking at, will be a victim of sexual abuse in her lifetime. 1 to 10 to 20 men. And again, just depending on what number we're looking at, maybe somewhere between 10 to 16% are really coming forward, are reporting the abuse that is occurring. So the largest majority, again, whatever number we're choosing, is going underreported. And so when we look specifically at the next slide, we'll look more again at the children that we kind of talked about. And so our numbers locally meet those that are national numbers very, very similar in nature. So we're not, I wouldn't say unique or different in the Wichita area. I think we fall right in line in regards to what we tend to see that's going on at a national level. Certainly there can be times where there's peaks or ebbs and flows that might look different, that fall a bit different than what we would expect to see. But by and large, when we look kind of over that long haul of time, we're not too unusual in regards to what we would expect from a numbers standpoint as it goes from a reporting standpoint. And we can move forward again. So when we look again just a little bit more in relation to specifically child abuse and how that affects our family systems, that becomes one of the challenges that we really have to continue to look at, that this is not an isolated circumstance when the abuse is occurring somewhere related to the home situation. Most often in the home, but sometimes not directly in the home. It might be, again, an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent, someone, again, who is a trusted individual, whether that's through a scouts group or a church group, someone who's known or generally trusted to the family. But when we look at that, it becomes a situation where there's an entire family involvement, and it's not just the child that we're looking at any longer in those particular cases. So we can see a significant amount of runaways, and our runaway cases have a high concern for previous sexual abuse as a child. When we look at our children who are entrapped in the sexual exploitation, human trafficking kinds of situations, the numbers are off the charts in regards to their prior experience having sexual abuse being a part of that history. And so that again can be one of those protective factors, and one of the prevention factors that we can look at is if we can implement services very early on, is there an opportunity for us to change the course of what happens to that child and them ending up in sexual exploitation kinds of situations. And we know through positive support systems, through good therapy, through the right kinds of services, that can make a significant difference in that trajectory as we look at the long term in regards to that as well. And so again, we know that children learn from their parents, and that can be both good and bad. Many things that we learn about parenting comes from our parents. And so what we do tend to see is that oftentimes that bad behavior in particular can be repeated generation after generation. If that's how I was treated, if that's how my grandparents treated my parents, etc., it becomes much more of a norm in a person's mind if that's what they have seen from a historical perspective, and they don't have other tools and other ways to be able to recognize that there's other opportunities of how to discipline or interact with a child in a particular manner. And so we can see that being very generational in many circumstances, which doesn't mean it has to be generational, but there has to be an opportunity to learn new ways of being able to handle those particular situations. Suicide is certainly one of the things that we are concerned about when children are stuck in situations that they see as being hopeless and helpless, and that they can't find a way out of that particular situation. Suicide might be one of the situations that we come across in those particular areas as well. But when we talk specifically about churches, I think that there's lots of roles for churches, and we're going to look specifically at some of those kinds of things this evening. as well, but just knowing that we carry with ourselves as a church member a higher level of liability, specifically because we tend to be rather, we tend to be rather assuming that when someone wants to volunteer within our church, that they're doing it for the right reasons. We're all here for the right reasons. We're protecting youth. We want to see what's best in youth. And what we have to recognize is that offenders are exceptionally crafty at what they do. And the reason that we hear so frequently on the first interview with law enforcement or first interview with TV is, oh, he seemed like such a nice guy. Guess what? He bets on the fact that you're going to think he's a nice guy. That's why you've trusted him in that particular circumstance. And so we really have to be aware of those kind of particular circumstances. So when someone comes in and wants to be a youth sponsor, nothing wrong with that at all, but are we doing our due diligence to make sure we know what we can find out about that person, who their other connections are, what references do they have in regards to that, and what is the history of where they've come from? Because again, we can see that kind of church hopping, church moving that can happen with that situation as well. So we'll continue forward. The Jerry Sandusky case, I think, is a good example. Penn State's situation with their coach brought about an opportunity for us to be able to say, you know, even someone who is in a very predominant leadership role can be doing inappropriate things with children under the very eyes of other predominant people in the community. And I think that there's some take-home messages that I hope we don't lose through whether you are a Penn State or aren't a Penn State fan kind of a situation. All adults have the responsibility to protect children. That is number one, the most important thing that we have to take away from that situation. We had adults in those situations that later said, yeah, you know, there were things that bothered me, or there were things that just didn't seem quite right, or I reported it, but nothing happened, so I just dropped it. Again, that falls back on our responsibilities as adults. The next one I would say, sex offenders are clever. Again, that goes back to what we just kind of talked about. They rely on the fact that you're going to believe them. Believability is one of the worst enemies for children because, by and large, adults will believe another adult over a child, hands down. If there's a plausible explanation offered to us by an adult and there's one equally plausible but maybe not as strong from a child, we're much more likely to side with the adult side of us. It's just who we are. Nothing wrong with that, but I'm just saying that that's a challenge for children in those particular situations because we don't take their account as serious as we ought to. Children are not responsible for their own protection, and I hear folks saying, well, why didn't they tell someone? Why didn't they do something? You know, the reality is that children aren't going to tell unless they're asked in a situation where they trust the individual who's asking them. There's a trust factor that's, they know when they can say something and when they can't, or they'll give a piece of information, and based off of what information or how you react, can change what additional information that child gives. Sometimes, particularly with parents, we'll hear the parents, you know, the child will say, well, I told them, I said X, Y, and Z, and the parent never heard that as a disclosure. They didn't know that what that child was saying to them at the time was a disclosure of abuse, but the child tested the water, so to speak, with a little bit of information that they gave them, and when that wasn't acted on, they assumed that everything was okay. So again, we don't always know that we can perceive how a child sees that situation, but it is part of that challenge that we have. And then again, you know, we have the moral and ethical obligation to report abuse. And I think that that's one of the things that, having been in this field as long as I have, I hear people frequently say, well, what happens if I make a report and I'm wrong? I don't want to have made somebody go through that terrible investigation process, and what if they remove the children, or what if the parents are really put out in that situation because there's an investigation? And my challenge to folks would be to flip this coin on that one. What if you're right and you've chosen to do nothing about it? What if you're right and you don't make a report and that abuse continues on for years and years? I'm not saying that any one of the systems that we work within are infallible. There are always opportunities for us to continue to grow and improve and learn from previous situations. The fact is that we are human and we're dealing with humans. That's the reality to it. But what I would say is that by and large, because we work so closely with so many different disciplines, that checks and balances system is there, and it's there for that very intention, that if we hear a suspicion that doesn't have a valid point to it, that isn't of concern, someone may be able to pick that up in regards to it. But the investigation process is set out to be able to help kind of figure those different kinds of things out and not be able to narrow that so terribly much. We'll continue then. So several different kinds of signs and symptoms that we see in regards to what we refer to as indicators of different kinds of abuse that we might be concerned about. Unexplainable injuries are probably really one of those kind of key factors, things that just don't necessarily make sense. Oh, they got that split on the top of their head from falling down the stairs. Well, do we see bruises all over their body, in parts of our body that we wouldn't normally just be clumsy about hitting? Are there other concerns that we have in specific related to that? Changes in behavior is another very common portion of that, where a child maybe used to be very outgoing and interactive with their classmates, and now they've become very withdrawn and they don't interact, and they are very fearful of doing things that used to be very common, comfortable things for them to be able to do. Possibly reverting to earlier behaviors, so thumb sucking or talking like a child, not doing as many activities as what they're capable of doing at their age or what they previously have been doing at a different time. Fear of going home, changes in eating, that might be overeating, undereating, binge eating. What we see is that children will choose things that they can control. When their whole life is chaos, they choose the few things that they can have control over. Changes in sleeping. This one again is one of those situations where we hear very, very frequently where children will have had nightmares, night terrors in regards to the interruption of sleep patterns that have occurred because of abuse situations. And certainly sometimes it's because the abuse is occurring at night and there's an interruption of their sleep pattern based off of what is happening during that particular time. But changes in school performance. I think of